Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a story that's colder, harsher, and somehow more human than you might expect. Even at the tail end of the 19th century, when trains already roared through cities and factories belched smoke into the sky, the way ordinary people faced the winter still carried the soul of the Middle Ages. If you enjoy history told through the real fabric of daily life, make sure to hit that like button and follow, because this is going to be a journey full of frozen nights, smoky huts, and the ingenious ways our ancestors wrapped themselves against death itself. Let's set the scene. Imagine England, or Poland, or the Russian countryside, in the winter of 1880. Snow covers the ground in thick blankets, ice grips the rivers, and the wind has teeth sharp enough to make your skin ache. Central heating, thick insulated glass, and padded jackets, forget all of that. Houses were drafty, windows rattled in their frames, and smoke from the hearth often filled the room more than it warmed it. To survive, you needed clothing that didn't just look good, it had to be your shield, your armor, your second skin against the elements. This is where medieval knowledge, carried across centuries, still shaped lives. Wool, fur, linen, and leather weren't just materials, they were lifelines. Wool came first, always. It wasn't fancy, but it was genius. Unlike cotton, which clings wet and cold, wool keeps warmth even when it's damp. That made all the difference when sleet or snow soaked through. Farmers and laborers wore thick wool tunics, layered with stockings and capes, each piece heavy but protective. Cloaks were pinned tight at the chest or belted at the waist, not for style, but to keep out wind that could cut like a blade. Families often owned just one or two cloaks, and those pieces lasted for years, patched again and again, smelling of smoke from countless nights by the fire. Still, when you pulled that cloak around your shoulders, you knew it could mean the difference between shivering through the night and actually seeing the morning. Scarves and improvised wraps added another layer. We think of scarves as knitted, colorful, almost decorative. But in 1880 rural Europe, a scarf might be nothing more than a strip of wool cloth or a scrap of fur wrapped around the neck and lower face. People wound them over and over, covering the mouth so that each breath was warmed before it reached the lungs. In blizzards, some tucked rabbit skins beneath scarves, turning every inhale into a little shield against frostbite. Imagine trudging through snow up to your knees, clutching a piece of fur against your face just to keep your lips from cracking and your breath from burning. It wasn't fashion, it was survival. And then there was fur, the most controversial material of all. It was warm, no doubt about it, and it carried social weight. Nobles flaunted ermine and sable, their pure white and black tips signaling wealth and power. But in villages, trappers stitched together rabbit pelts for mittens or lined boots with sheepskin. In Poland and Ukraine, the sheepskin coat became iconic, so heavy and thick it could almost stand up on its own. Families guarded these coats fiercely. They were treasures, often passed down in wills alongside land or livestock. The smell of lanolin and smoke clung to them, but when temperatures dropped below freezing, no one cared how they smelled. What mattered was that they kept you alive. Boots told their own story. Cold always attacked from the ground up, and a good pair of boots was worth more than gold. The rich wore leather boots lined with fur, soles layered thick to block the frozen earth, often decorated to show off their wealth. But peasants? They made do with rough leather, wooden clogs, or boots stuffed with straw. Yes, straw. It sounds crude, but it worked. Each morning, you packed in fresh straw, and it acted as insulation, absorbing sweat, trapping heat, keeping toes from turning black with frostbite. In Russia, people sometimes layered rags over their feet before sliding them into bark shoes. It wasn't elegant, but it bought them precious time. And losing a toe wasn't just inconvenient, it could ruin your ability to work, to farm, to survive. Frostbite was a killer, and everyone knew it. Hands couldn't be neglected either. Wool mittens were common, the fibers greasy with lanolin that gave some water resistance. Craftsmen relied on leather gloves, thick enough to shield skin from iron, stone, or frozen tools. Wealthy families, of course, turned warmth into a display of luxury, with fur-lined gloves embroidered with pearls or precious stones. But here's the thing, even the fanciest glove had to work. You could flaunt your status all you wanted, but if your fingers froze, you were just as vulnerable as the man breaking ice at the well. And what about the head? Everyone knew you had to keep it covered. Simple wool caps pulled low over the ears were enough for peasants. Women tied wimples under their chins, fabric layers that shielded the neck and face from biting wind. Knights and workers wore coifs, plain linen caps that kept hair neat and offered a layer beneath heavier hoods or helmets. Nobles, as always, elevated it into fashion velvet, silk, and brocade trimmed with fur, turbans wrapped in elaborate layers, but still, the goal was warmth. Because step outside bareheaded, and you'd feel the cold sink into your bones in minutes. What strikes me is how clothing carried two stories at once: survival and status. The same cloak that kept a farmer alive in a snowstorm could, in richer fabric, mark a noble as powerful. The same scarf that a peasant tied from rabbit skins, a lady might drape in sable. Yet beneath those differences, everyone was fighting the same enemy, the cold. And clothing wasn't just decoration. It was engineering, carefully layered, meticulously maintained, passed down, patched, and repurposed. Each garment was a tool, and each tool was part of a larger system built not for beauty alone, but for life itself. So when we talk about medieval winter clothing lasting into 1880, we're not just talking about cloaks and boots. We're talking about centuries of inherited wisdom stitched into every seam. Every layer of wool, every fur lining, every scarf wound tight around a face in the snowstorm. They all tell us one truth: that survival wasn't about comfort, but about endurance. And in the freezing dark of a 19th century winter, that endurance was everything. Now, let's keep going. We've seen how cloaks, scarves, and boots worked as shields against the cold. But there's another detail most people overlook: linings. In the winter of 1880, when heating a house meant nothing more than banking coals under ash, linings were not a luxury. They were the quiet, invisible armor inside every garment. A good lining could mean that your only coat lasted 5 more years, or that your body kept its heat through a night so cold your breath froze in your beard. Linings were clever because they did 3 jobs at once. First, they trapped air, and air, when it sits still, is the best insulator of all. Second, they absorbed sweat and dirt, keeping the outer garment cleaner and longer lasting. Third, they shaped the clothing, giving it weight and structure so it didn't sag or twist. People stitched in wool, coarse linen, even scraps of fur if they could find it. Wealthier families flaunted silks and velvets, sometimes dyed in deep reds or blues that flashed when sleeves moved. But even the poorest laborer might unpick and wash a linen lining instead of trying to clean a whole cloak, because washing heavy wool in winter could ruin it forever. Imagine that an invisible piece of cloth became the heartbeat of an entire wardrobe. And here's something remarkable: reversible garments. They weren't common everywhere, but where tailors had skill, coats and cloaks were made double-sided. On one side, thick, dark wool to absorb sunlight and hold heat on those rare days when the sun broke through the clouds. On the other side, lighter fabric, often linen, which worked better in milder weather. It was like owning two coats in one, a practical miracle for travelers, merchants, or anyone who couldn't afford to carry a wardrobe on their back. Think about that. In a world where families owned maybe 3 or 4 garments total, a cloak you could flip inside out wasn't just smart, it was survival economics. Of course, clothing wasn't just for warmth, it was for movement too. Workers in the fields, blacksmiths at their forges, shepherds trudging through snowdrifts, none of them could afford to be wrapped like statues. So seams were cut to flex, gussets were stitched under arms, and trousers, or what passed for them, were layered for mobility. Before modern pants, there were woolen hose, tied up with garters, and breeches layered beneath tunics. These might sound crude now, but they kept muscles working and joints from stiffening in the cold. Even knights, centuries earlier, wore linen coifs under their armor to stop chainmail from biting into skin. That small trick still mattered in 1880, when workers tied linen caps under heavier hoods to keep sweat from freezing in their hair. Scarves deserve another word here, because they weren't the knitted ornaments we picture today. They were workhorses. Farmers wound thick woolen cloth across their mouths, and mothers wrapped their children's necks with rabbit pelts or scraps of fox fur. In blizzards, scarves doubled as face masks, and sometimes people even breathed through layers of wool to prevent frostbite in their lungs. Have you ever felt your breath freeze on your mustache? Imagine walking hours through that, with nothing but cloth and determination to keep you alive. Then came the little tricks, the folk wisdom that turned simple cloth into life-saving gear. Some villagers stitched tiny red patches into quilts or cloaks, believing red fabric warded off illness. Others rubbed fat or grease into leather boots, sealing them against wet snow. Children tucked hot stones, wrapped in rags, at the foot of their beds to keep their toes from freezing. Every stitch, every patch, every improvised solution carried centuries of inherited knowledge, passed down not by books, but by mothers teaching daughters, fathers teaching sons, neighbors helping neighbors, and always, clothing revealed class. A noble might strut in sable-trimmed gloves or velvet-lined boots, but a peasant patched the same wool cloak for 20 winters. Yet both relied on the same truth: the human body is fragile, and without protection, the cold wins. In that sense, whether you lived in a palace or a hut, your survival in 1880 was still shaped by medieval wisdom. So when we talk about fashion from this era, let's not imagine catwalks or vanity. Let's imagine survival stitched into every seam, wool soaked with lanolin, scarves wound tight against blizzards, reversible cloaks that doubled their worth, and linings that quietly held families together winter after winter. Think about it. No matter how many cloaks or scarves you wore, if your feet were wet and cold, frostbite wasn't far behind. In 1880, just like in the centuries before, footwear was the thin line between mobility and disaster. Peasants trudged through mud and snow in simple leather boots, often rough and cracked from constant use. These boots were thick enough to block snow, but rarely waterproof, so families coated them with tallow or animal fat to seal out moisture. It wasn't pretty, but it kept feet dry just long enough to make it through a day's labor. And then there was fur lining. If you were lucky or wealthy, you had boots lined with sheepskin, rabbit, or even fox fur. The warmth they trapped could mean the difference between keeping your toes or losing them. In fact, some 19th century travelers wrote about wrapping spare bits of fur or wool around their socks before pulling on boots, layering insulation wherever they could. Imagine slipping cold feet into boots and feeling the soft cushion of fur cradle your skin. It was relief, however temporary. For most peasants, though, luxury wasn't an option. They stuffed straw inside their boots to add a little insulation, replacing it every few days as it flattened or grew damp. Yes, straw, the same material they slept on. Dry straw acted as padding, as well as an extra barrier between the foot and the frozen ground. Crude? Absolutely, but effective enough to keep people walking. Now picture the nobility. Their footwear wasn't just practical, it was a statement. Leather boots lined with sable or ermine, tall riding boots with decorative buckles, even embroidered slippers worn inside drafty castles. Wealthy merchants might wear fur-trimmed boots with the lining spilling out deliberately, almost as if to announce, "Look at me, I can afford warmth you'll never touch." But even those boots, symbols of status, served the same essential purpose: survival in bitter cold. And here's something fascinating. Shoes were often paired with woolen stockings, tied up with garters. These stockings weren't just socks. They were armor against dampness and wind. Worn in layers, they clung to the legs, helping circulation and trapping heat. Among peasants, they were plain and practical. Among nobles, they were brightly dyed or embroidered, proof of wealth stitched into every thread. One detail you might not expect: heated stones. Before a long journey, people sometimes warmed flat stones in the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and slipped them into boots just before wearing. It gave a few minutes of blissful heat, just long enough to step into the morning chill without crying out. Others sprinkled ashes inside their footwear, believing it repelled dampness and even vermin. Strange, perhaps, but when the wind cut through like knives, no trick was too small to try. Feet were everything. Farmers couldn't plow fields, herders couldn't guide animals, and soldiers couldn't march without them. And in 1880, winter made no exceptions. Shoes, stockings, straw, fur, each one was a layer in humanity's battle against frost, because survival wasn't just about cloaks and hoods. It started from the ground up. Hands might seem small compared to the rest of the body, but in the cold of 1880, they were the first to suffer. Fingers stiffened, cracked, and went numb frighteningly fast. And when you needed to work outdoors, chop wood, guide animals, or even just hold a tool, frozen hands could mean disaster. For peasants, the solution was simple but rough: wool mittens. Not the sleek gloves we picture today, but thick, baggy coverings, often with no separate fingers. Why? because mittens trapped heat far better than gloves. By keeping fingers together in one shared pocket, body warmth stayed longer. Sometimes, mittens were stuffed with raw wool or lined with scraps of fur for extra insulation. They looked clumsy, but when survival was on the line, fashion wasn't the priority. Leather was another lifesaver. Farmers, masons, and smiths used thick hide gloves not just for warmth, but also to protect from blisters, cuts, and burns. In winter, leather soaked in oil or tallow made them more flexible and more resistant to wet snow. Even the most basic pair could keep hands dry long enough to haul wood or carry water back from a frozen well. But mittens and gloves were not just practical. They carried meaning. For nobles and wealthy townsfolk, hand coverings became a symbol of elegance. Picture a lady stepping into a carriage with a velvet muff, a cylinder of fur into which both hands slipped. Not only did it keep her warm, it also proclaimed her status. Muffs made of sable, ermine, or fox fur gleamed in candlelight, instantly marking their owner as someone who lived far above the muddy fields of common peasants. Knights and soldiers had their own form of hand protection: gauntlets. These weren't cozy mittens, but armored gloves made of leather, chainmail, and steel plates. Though designed for battle, they often had wool or linen padding inside. Without it, a knight's hand would have frozen stiff before he even raised his sword. Function and survival always intertwined. One curious detail from rural traditions: some families believed that rubbing garlic or onion juice on the skin before slipping on mittens kept frostbite away. Strange as it sounds, they swore the oils helped blood flow and warmed the flesh. Others tucked sprigs of dried herbs like rosemary or sage into their gloves, convinced they carried protective magic against frost and illness. And let's not forget the children. Mothers often tied mittens to strings that threaded through coats, so little ones wouldn't lose them in the snow. Sound familiar? It's a trick still used today, passed down through centuries of cold winters. If you were wealthy in 1880, gloves weren't just warm. They were decorated, embroidered with silk, studded with pearls, or edged with fur trim. Removing gloves in the presence of royalty wasn't just courtesy, it was ritual. But for the poor, hands covered in coarse wool, patched leather, or even rags wrapped tightly around the fingers told a different story, one of endurance rather than elegance. If you've ever stepped outside on a freezing day without a hat or scarf, you know how quickly the cold cuts through. Now imagine 1,880. No heated buses, no warm jackets lined with modern insulation, just raw wind, snow, and endless frost. For ordinary people, protecting the head and neck wasn't just about comfort. It was survival. Wool was the first line of defense. Peasants wore simple hoods pulled over their heads, often attached to cloaks so the wind couldn't sneak down the back of the neck. These hoods were roomy enough to wrap around part of the face, creating a crude shield against icy gusts. Some even had long lyra pipes, tails of cloth that could be wound like a scarf around the neck for extra warmth. Nothing was wasted, even design quirks doubled as protection. Underneath the hoods, many men and women wore a coif, a plain linen cap that tied under the chin. At first glance, it looked modest, even boring, but it served a vital purpose. It kept hair neat, stopped sweat and oils from soiling expensive outer layers, and provided an extra barrier against the cold. Knights even wore coifs beneath chainmail, proving how universal and practical they were. For women, head coverings blended warmth with social rules. Married women often wore wimples, cloths that wrapped around the neck and under the chin, sometimes paired with a barbette strap that secured everything in place. Beyond being a sign of modesty, the wimple worked like a built-in scarf, blocking cold air from the throat and chest. Imagine standing in a drafty stone hall or trudging across a frozen field. That extra layer around the neck could mean the difference between comfort and a sore throat that might spiral into illness. And then there were the scarves. Today, we toss one around our neck without thinking. But in the Middle Ages and well into 1880, scarves carried deeper meaning. For peasants, a scarf might be nothing more than a strip of wool or linen wrapped tightly against the wind. But for nobles, fur scarves were statements of power. Fox, sable, or ermine draped across the shoulders, soft against the skin, gleaming with wealth. These scarves didn't just keep out the cold, they announced status with every step. In fact, fur had its own hierarchy. Rabbit or sheepskin for the common folk, fox and sable for the wealthy, and ermine reserved almost exclusively for royalty and the church. Imagine walking into a gathering with a strip of ermine fur across your shoulders. You weren't just warm, you were declaring yourself untouchable. But scarves and hoods were also improvisational. In blizzards, people sometimes wrapped whatever they had, blankets, cloaks, or even spare skirts around their faces to survive the sting of snow. Some accounts tell of travelers rubbing grease or fat on their cheeks to protect against frostbite, then wrapping cloth strips around their heads until only their eyes were visible. A desperate solution, but sometimes the only one. Even turbans and felt hats had their place. Men working outdoors often wore layers of wool wrapped around the head, like crude versions of modern ski caps. Felt hats, when treated with oil or wax, shed water and snow surprisingly well, keeping the scalp dry in a storm. And just like with gloves, the difference between poor and rich was stark. A farmer's hood might be coarse, patched, and heavy. A noble's headdress, on the other hand, could be velvet lined with fur, embroidered with gold, yet still practical enough to ward off the cold. Think about your favorite coat today. Chances are, it isn't just the outer fabric keeping you warm, it's the lining inside. The same was true back in 1880, when medieval-style layering still shaped rural life. The lining wasn't flashy, but it was the hidden hero of every garment. Why? Because it created that essential pocket of air between the body and the world outside. A fur or wool lining could trap warmth, keeping people alive through nights when temperatures dropped so low that water froze inside their huts. Even a simple linen lining helped, because it absorbed sweat and oils, protecting the heavier outer fabrics from breaking down. Picture a farmer trudging through snow in a rough woolen cloak. If the cloak had no lining, sweat and grime would seep straight into the fibers, weakening them. But with a layer of linen inside, the cloak lasted longer and stayed warmer. When the lining grew too filthy, it could be removed, washed, and stitched back in. In a world where every scrap of fabric was precious, this small trick extended a garment's life by years. And fur linings? Those were the crown jewel. Rabbit or sheepskin for common folk, fox or sable for the wealthy, and mink or ermine for the elite. If you saw fur peeking from the edge of someone's cloak in 1880, you instantly knew their standing in society. It wasn't just warmth. It was a status announcement. Some laws even restricted which furs could be worn by whom, turning linings into a social code stitched right into clothing. But linings weren't only about warmth or wealth. They gave garments structure. A doublet or cloak with a stiff linen lining sat straighter on the shoulders, looked sharper, and held its shape in wind or rain. For nobles, this meant elegance. For peasants, it meant practicality. A cloak that didn't sag when wet was a cloak that protected you better. And sometimes linings became a secret display of luxury. Cloaks might look plain on the outside, but when a noble removed it, a flash of bright silk or patterned cloth inside told a different story. That hidden pop of color was a way to show off wealth without shouting it. Subtle but powerful. There were even clever tricks. In some places, people lined their clothing with fur turned inward warmth first. Others flipped it outward in bitter storms, letting the thick pelt take the beating from snow and sleet. Imagine trudging through a blizzard, fur side out, snow clinging to the surface, but never reaching your skin. Then, once inside, flipping it back to look polished and neat. Multifunctional, practical, and smart. Even the choice of lining material reflected survival priorities. Linen for hygiene, wool for durability, fur for warmth, silk for comfort and status. Each stitch was a decision shaped by climate, by class, and by necessity. And in 1880, when winters were unforgiving, linings were more than fabric. They were insulation, armor, and identity. Hands were the most exposed, most vulnerable part of the body. People needed them for everything: chopping wood, herding animals, stitching clothes, cooking over smoky fires. And yet, in winter, hands were the first to stiffen, burn with cold, and lose their strength. How did people fight back? With whatever materials they could turn into coverings. For peasants, that meant mittens, simple wool bags for the hands, no fancy fingers, just a pouch of heat. Why mittens instead of gloves? Because keeping the fingers together trapped body heat better. One mitten could be coarse and scratchy, but it saved lives in snow-swept fields. Some even stuffed them with scraps of straw or wool clippings for extra insulation, a kind of homemade padding. But leather also came into play. Farmers and craftsmen often wore thick hide mitts, rugged and stiff, protecting not only from frost, but from cuts and burns. A blacksmith in 1880 would still use leather gloves, much like his medieval ancestors, lined with wool or fur for long winter shifts at the forge. Now compare that with the nobility. While peasants worked with rough mittens, wealthy men and women showed off with gloves, cut from soft leather, trimmed with fur, embroidered with gold thread, or even studded with pearls. Ladies flaunted muffs, long fur-lined tubes into which both hands disappeared, like portable hand warmers. Imagine strolling through a snowy street with a sable muff instantly. You were marked as someone who had wealth and taste. And these hand coverings weren't just about fashion. They carried meaning. A knight's gauntlets, centuries before, symbolized honor tossed down a glove, and you issued a challenge. By 1880, gauntlets were no longer tools of war, but the tradition lingered in ceremony and memory. Even ordinary gloves carried a kind of silent message. To remove your glove when greeting someone important showed respect. To give a glove as a gift was intimate, almost a promise. The choice of material told stories too. Rabbit and sheepskin were for common folk, functional and cheap. Fox, marten, or sable belonged to the rich. A fur muff or lining, turning every gesture into a display of status. In fact, records show that fur-lined mittens could cost more than a peasant earned in months. Imagine the envy and the practicality of such a treasure. There were also small innovations. Some mittens had separate thumbs but no fingers, striking a balance between dexterity and warmth. Others were tied with cords to sleeves so they wouldn't be lost in the snow. Children often wore mittens connected with a string through their coats. Yes, that trick is older than you think. And in the harshest storms, when gloves alone weren't enough, people wrapped their hands in spare cloth, scarves, or even strips of fur. Hunters trekking into frozen forests often tucked hot stones, fresh from the fire, into leather pouches and gripped them inside their mitts. A crude but clever way to keep frostbite at bay. So, whether it was a farmer pulling turnips from frozen soil or a lady stepping into a carriage, everyone had their own way of guarding their hands. Because in winter, warm fingers weren't just about comfort, they were about survival. Think about it. One icy gust across your ears, one night of snow pressing against a drafty wall, and suddenly you're chilled to the bone. So what did people do? They wrapped, layered, and covered their heads with everything from simple linen caps to extravagant fur-lined hoods. For common folk, the simplest and most reliable solution was the humble woolen hood. Coarse, thick, and pulled low across the brow, it doubled as both a hat and a scarf. Some even extended down to the shoulders, sealing out the wind. When storms howled across the fields, farmers would tug their hoods tighter and knot cloth around the neck. It wasn't fashionable, but it kept them alive. But there was more. Beneath the hood, many wore a coif, a thin linen cap that hugged the scalp. It sounds basic, but it was genius. Why? Because linen could be washed, unlike heavy wool cloaks. The coif absorbed sweat and dirt, protecting the outer layers. And in a world where laundry was grueling work, that mattered more than you might think. For women, modesty and survival blended together. Married women often wore wimples, cloth wrapped under the chin and across the neck. In summer, it was about propriety. In winter, it was about warmth. A simple length of linen could be the difference between a frozen throat and a protected one. And here's something fascinating. Some records mention women wrapping their wimples tighter during storms, tucking in sprigs of herbs like sage or rosemary, believing they warded off both frost and illness. Practical, symbolic, and deeply human. Then came scarves and shawls. In the 1,882 countryside, peasants twisted wool scarves around their necks until only their eyes showed, like makeshift armor against snow and wind. Wealthier families, meanwhile, turned to fur. Fox, marten, even sable scarves draped over shoulders, soft and luxurious, but also brutally effective at holding in warmth. These weren't knotted like today's scarves. Often, they were laid across the shoulders or fastened with a pin, sometimes even worn inside cloaks for added insulation. And let's not forget headwear as fashion. Nobles paraded chaperones and elaborate felt hats, some with long trailing ends that could be wrapped around the neck like an improvised scarf. Women in cities wore turbans or velvet caps lined with fur, both elegant and practical. Even in 1880, echoes of these traditions lingered in rural Europe, a reminder that winter clothing was always a blend of necessity and identity. Scarves and hoods weren't just fabric. They carried meaning. A simple woolen scarf told the world you worked the land. A fur stole whispered that you had money, connections, and power. And yet, whether you were a farmer trudging through snow or a lady stepping into a ballroom, the goal was the same: protect the head, shield the neck, survive another winter day. One more curious detail in the harshest storms: people sometimes wrapped extra cloth directly over their faces. Snow could blind, wind could tear skin raw. So peasants bound rags across their mouths and noses, leaving only narrow slits for eyes. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. In a sense, it was the ancestor of our modern winter balaclavas. Here's the thing: outer garments might have caught the eye, but linings were what kept people alive. In the bitter winters of 1880, especially in rural Europe, where stone cottages and wooden huts were drafty at best, the inside of your clothing mattered almost more than the outside. Picture a heavy wool cloak. On its own, it could block some wind and rain, sure, but line it with fur, sheepskin, rabbit, even fox if you were lucky, and suddenly you had a portable furnace on your shoulders. Linings trapped air, that invisible barrier of warmth that made the difference between comfort and frostbite. For the wealthy, lining became an art. Cloaks, doublets, even gloves were trimmed with sable, mink, or ermine. Ermine especially carried a powerful message. Its white fur, speckled with black tips, was reserved for royalty and high clergy. So when you saw a noble swish into a hall with ermine peeking from their cloak, you weren't just seeing insulation, you were seeing a badge of rank. But the story doesn't stop with luxury. For everyday people, linings were the silent guardians of their meager wardrobes. Linen, though plain, was invaluable. Why? Because it could be washed. Outer wool garments were rarely laundered. Soap and scrubbing wore the fibers down too quickly. Instead, peasants stitched in linen linings that soaked up sweat and oils. When dirty, the lining could be unpicked, washed, and sewn back in, extending the life of garments that might have to last years, even decades. This invisible layer also protected skin. Thick wool rubbed raw against the body, especially in constant labor. Linen linings smoothed the friction, making movement bearable. It was comfort, hygiene, and longevity rolled into one. And here's a detail you won't find in most history books. Some linings were deliberately colorful. While the outside cloak might be drab and plain, turn it back and you could find flashes of red, green, or patterned silk. For the wealthy, it was a way of showing flair without being too ostentatious. For peasants, a dyed lining, maybe with onion skins for yellow or walnut husks for brown, was a small act of beauty in an otherwise gray winter. Shoes and boots relied on linings too. Fur stuffed into leather boots kept toes from freezing solid. Sometimes straw was packed inside, as makeshift insulation, not glamorous, but effective. Accounts from the late 19th century even mentioned children stuffing newspaper inside their boots as a lining against snow. Ingenuity, not luxury, was the rule. Linings weren't just practical, they told stories. A mother stitching scraps of old tunics into the inside of a new coat wasn't only recycling fabric, she was layering history onto her child's back. Each patch, each seam carried memory. Scholars point out that many garments became family heirlooms precisely because of their linings, invisible but irreplaceable. If you've ever stepped outside in freezing weather without gloves or good boots, you know exactly how quickly the cold finds you. Fingers stiffen, toes burn with numbness, and within minutes you're desperate for warmth. Now imagine enduring that in 1880, with no central heating, no insulated boots from a modern store, and no fleece-lined mittens. For people back then, protecting their hands and feet wasn't just about comfort, it was survival. Let's start with gloves. For the poor, gloves were rarely elegant. Most were simple mittens made of coarse wool. Nothing fancy, just bags for the hands stitched together with a thumb hole. That design trapped heat better than fingered gloves and was far easier to make. Workers wore them in the fields, shepherds wore them in the snow, and children often had mittens knit by mothers out of whatever scraps of yarn could be spared. Leather was another option, tougher and longer lasting. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons used thick leather gloves to guard against cuts and burns. But the same gloves doubled as winter gear. And for farmers braving icy mornings, leather mitts lined with fleece or sheepskin were the best barrier against frostbite. But for the nobility, gloves were an entirely different story. They weren't just warm, they were statements. Silk gloves embroidered with pearls, velvet trimmed with fur, or finely worked leather gloves that fit like a second skin. In medieval tradition, carried into the 19th century, gloves often held symbolic weight. Knights once threw down gauntlets to issue challenges. In the 1,880 seconds, elegant gloves at a ball were a subtle signal of refinement, wealth, and even romance. Removing them before greeting someone of higher rank was a sign of respect. Muffs were especially popular among wealthy women. Imagine a cylinder of fur, open at both ends, where you could slip your hands inside. Warm, stylish, and absolutely impractical for hard labor, which was exactly the point. A noblewoman strolling through a frosty street with a mink or sable muff wasn't just keeping her hands warm, she was announcing to the world that she didn't need to work with them. Now let's move down to the feet, the true battleground against the cold. For the wealthy, leather boots lined with fur were the gold standard, tough on the outside, warm and soft on the inside. They could withstand long carriage rides through snowy roads or hunting trips in icy forests. Some were tall, reaching up the calf, with fur deliberately spilling over the edges to show off the luxury. Others were short, practical, but no less expensive. For peasants, the story was different. Many wore simple leather shoes, sometimes reinforced with wooden soles, and stuffed the insides with straw or scraps of cloth for insulation. In some regions, wooden clogs were common, heavy, awkward, but durable, against wet snow. Children often wore hand-me-downs too large or too small, their parents desperate just to keep something on their feet. Toes might be wrapped in rags or patched wool socks, layered until they barely fit inside. Fur linings made all the difference, but they were not always affordable. Rabbit, sheep, or goat fur was the most accessible, while fox, sable, or ermine were reserved for the rich. Travelers and hunters relied heavily on fur-lined boots, because frozen feet could mean death on long journeys. Soldiers, too, often suffered frostbite when supplies ran short. Military records from the late 19th century tell grim tales of men losing toes simply because boots weren't lined properly. And here's a fascinating detail. In villages, people sometimes warmed stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them into boots before heading outside. It gave maybe an hour of relief. But in deep winter, an hour could mean finishing your chores before frostbite set in. When you think of winter survival, the first image that comes to mind might be boots and gloves. But in 1880, across Europe and beyond, one of the most crucial weapons against the cold was something deceptively simple: the scarf. Today we treat scarves like an accessory, a splash of color or fashion. Back then, a scarf could mean the difference between frostbite and survival. Most scarves were not delicate silks or lace. They were thick wool, knitted or woven by hand, often coarse and scratchy, but wonderfully warm. People wrapped them tightly around their necks, covering not just the throat, but often the chin, cheeks, and even part of the nose. Have you ever tried breathing into a scarf on a freezing morning and felt the air grow warmer with each breath? That's exactly what they counted on. The scarf didn't just protect against the chill, it recycled warmth, keeping the biting wind off bare skin. For peasants, a scarf might be nothing more than a strip of rough wool or even an old piece of cloth cut from a worn-out tunic. Some wrapped kerchiefs or shawls around their heads, doubling them as both head and neck coverings. In some farming communities, women would tie long woolen wraps so securely that only their eyes were left exposed, an early version of a winter face mask. The nobility, of course, elevated scarves into status symbols. Fur scarves were the pinnacle. Imagine a length of fox or sable fur draped across your shoulders, soft and glistening, its warmth almost decadent compared to a peasant's scratchy wool. These scarves weren't tied roughly either. They were pinned with brooches, embroidered with silk, or even adorned with pearls. The richer the fur, the higher the status. And in some kingdoms, laws even dictated who was allowed to wear certain furs. Ermine, for example, was reserved for royalty or clergy. But scarves weren't the only way people wrapped themselves. Cloaks were the real workhorses of medieval-style winter clothing that survived well into the 19th century. Long, heavy, made of thick wool, and often lined with fur, cloaks were the outer armor against the elements. A good cloak reached the ankles, blocking icy winds, and even shielding against snow and rain. Think of them as the overcoats of their time. For travelers, cloaks were essential. Carriage rides could take hours through blizzards, and without that heavy barrier, people would freeze long before they reached their destination. Cloaks often had hoods sewn in, allowing wearers to pull them forward and protect their faces. For peasants walking to market in winter, the hooded cloak was practically universal. It kept out snow, rain, and wind in one simple piece. Interestingly, cloaks could also be reversible. One side dark wool for daily use, the other side lined with lighter fabric or fur for warmth or even formal occasions. It was both practical and economical, two garments in one. For merchants, travelers, and anyone who needed to move often, this versatility was priceless. Layering was everything. A tunic, then a woolen surcoat, then a cloak, topped with a scarf and maybe a fur wrap. Some families kept old furs patched together from animals hunted decades before, stitched into shawls or wraps. In times of blizzards, even rags became useful. Villagers sometimes wrapped strips of cloth around arms and legs just for an extra layer of insulation. Every scrap counted. And here's a fascinating little detail. In storms, When the wind grew brutal, people often crossed scarves over their chests beneath their cloaks, almost like an improvised harness. This trapped warmth against the lungs and heart, preventing the deadly chill from sinking too deeply. It's a trick you'll still see echoed today in Arctic gear, crossing layers to hold body heat closer to the core. If there's one place the cold loves to steal heat from, it's the head. People in 1880 understood this instinctively, even without modern science explaining how much body warmth can escape from an uncovered scalp. That's why headwear wasn't just about fashion, it was survival. For ordinary villagers, the simplest option was the woolen hood. It was pulled over the head, long enough to cover the ears and sometimes the shoulders too. These hoods often had tails called liripipes, long pieces of fabric that could be wrapped like a scarf or tied under the chin for extra warmth. A practical design that solved multiple problems in one. Then there were coifs, those close-fitting linen caps that hugged the scalp. Knights wore them under helmets, but everyday folk wore them under woolen hats or hoods to trap heat. A layer of linen against the skin helped absorb sweat and dirt, making it easier to wash than a heavy wool hood. Imagine working all day in the fields or tending animals. Your outer garments might be filthy, but a clean coif underneath made life bearable. Women had their own variations. The wimple, for instance, covered the neck and chin, often fastened with a barbette strap under the chin. This wasn't just about modesty, though religion and custom made that part important. It was also about warmth. The wimple shielded skin from biting winds and made sure the vulnerable throat stayed covered. A woman working in the fields with a wimple had one less place for frost to creep in. Noble families transformed headwear into statements of wealth. Instead of coarse wool, their hoods could be made of velvet, silk, or brocade, lined with ermine or sable. Decorative embroidery, gold thread, or gemstones turned a practical necessity into a display of status. Yet even in those lavish designs, the practical goal remained. Keep heat in, keep the cold out. Materials mattered enormously. Wool was king for the masses, repelling moisture and holding warmth. Linen worked as a breathable inner layer. Fur, fox, marten, rabbit, or even squirrel was the gold standard for insulation. In wealthier towns, men wore felt hats, shaped to keep snow from clinging, while women donned structured headdresses that doubled as insulation for elaborate hairstyles. Some winter hats doubled as multi-purpose tools. The chaperone, originally a simple hood, could evolve into a shoulder wrap or scarf when unwound. People tied its long ends across their face in blizzards, covering everything but their eyes. That kind of adaptability was survival ingenuity at its best. And let's not forget superstition. Many families whispered blessings when putting on head coverings before stepping into the snow. Covering the head was seen not only as physical protection, but as a shield against spirits of illness or misfortune. Some mothers told their children, "Never let your head face the wind, bear the cold rides into your bones that way." Practical advice wrapped in folklore. When you think about winter clothing, it's easy to picture cloaks, boots, or hats. But the unsung hero of warmth was something hidden: the lining. In 1880, lining wasn't a luxury detail, it was a lifeline. It transformed ordinary garments into barriers against frost. For peasants, the simplest linings were rough linen or coarse wool sewn inside cloaks and tunics. These inner layers did two things at once. They trapped air for insulation and absorbed sweat, keeping the heavier outer garment usable for longer. It may sound simple, but that trick extended the life of precious clothing in a world where new cloth was expensive. For the wealthy, lining became an art. Fur linings, sheepskin, rabbit, fox, even sable or ermine, made garments feel like walking blankets. Imagine pulling on a velvet cloak with a thick fox fur interior. Not only were you protected from the bitter cold, but anyone who saw you instantly recognized your wealth. That little strip of fur peeking from the hem wasn't an accident, it was a statement. Linings also added structure. A cloak with a wool lining draped differently than one without. Sleeves, collars, and hoods kept their shape better. In fact, many garments were cut deliberately oversized to leave room for thick linings in winter. Come summer, the lining could be removed and the garment worn lighter. That kind of seasonal adaptability was crucial when resources were limited. Another detail that mattered: hygiene. People didn't wash outer garments like wool cloaks often, if at all. Washing heavy wool could ruin its fibers. Instead, they washed the inner linen linings, which were easier to remove and clean. In this way, lining served almost like medieval underwear for the outer garment, a washable shield between body and fabric. Even churches recognized the value of linings. Parish accounts mention fur or wool-lined vestments for priests in cold stone chapels, proving that warmth mattered just as much in sacred spaces as in fields or homes. The symbolism of linings was powerful too. Nobles sometimes commissioned linings in bright colors that contrasted with the outer fabric. When the cloak swished open, flashes of crimson or gold silk signaled refinement and wealth. It wasn't just about staying warm, it was about being seen. Meanwhile, travelers and merchants depended on linings for sheer survival. On long journeys, when you couldn't carry many spare garments, a well-lined cloak meant the difference between frostbite and making it to the next village. Diaries from the late 19th century even note fur-lined coats as prized possessions, handed down like family heirlooms. When we think about winter survival, we often focus on cloaks, boots, or hearth fires. But ask yourself this: what's the very first part of your body that goes numb when you step into freezing air? It's your hands. They stiffen, they ache, and without protection, they can lose all function. For farmers, craftsmen, or soldiers in the winter of 1880, frozen hands meant you couldn't work, couldn't fight, and sometimes couldn't even eat. So hand coverings, from the simplest woolen mittens to the most elaborate fur-lined gloves, became some of the most essential tools of the season. Unlike today, where gloves are everywhere in endless styles, most working families had just one or two pairs, and sometimes none at all. Peasants might improvise with scraps of wool wrapped around their hands, or even stuff rags inside leather pouches. These makeshift mittens weren't elegant, but they worked. Coarse wool, even when damp, trapped air and kept some warmth. That was the genius of natural fibers. They didn't need perfection, only persistence. Mittens were especially common among the poor. Why mittens and not gloves with fingers? Because mittens are warmer. By keeping fingers together in one compartment, they conserve body heat far better than gloves. A simple wool mitten, crudely sewn, could make the difference between hands stiff with frost and hands still able to grip a tool. In villages across Europe, mothers knitted mittens not as fashion items, but as lifelines for their children. Some families even rubbed sheep fat or tallow into wool mittens to make them more water-resistant, a messy but effective trick against snow and sleet. For craftsmen and laborers, leather gloves were indispensable. Imagine a blacksmith in the biting cold. He couldn't risk bare hands against hot iron or rough tools, but thin wool wasn't enough either. Thick cowhide or goatskin gloves gave both insulation and protection. Carpenters, masons, and bricklayers often relied on the same, using gloves as shields, not just against frost, but also against splinters, cuts, and burns. These gloves were heavy, stiff, and not particularly comfortable, but they extended a man's working life through the cruel months of winter. Now, step into the world of the wealthy, and hand coverings took on an entirely different dimension. For noblewomen, the muff became an icon of elegance and survival. Picture a cylindrical tube of fur, sable, ermine, or fox into which a lady slid both hands. Soft, luxurious, and lined with silk, it was as much a display of refinement as it was protection. A muff said, "I am warm, and I am untouchable." It also said, "I do not labor outside in the cold fields." In fact, wearing a muff became shorthand for privilege itself. But gloves could also be deeply symbolic. For knights, the gauntlet was not only armor, but a language. To throw down the gauntlet was a literal act of challenge, signaling the start of combat. Yet in winter, gauntlets weren't always steel. Beneath those plates were leather gloves lined with wool or fur, ensuring that even in battle, a knight's grip did not fail from frostbite. The blend of functionality and symbolism here is striking. Gloves were both shields and statements. By 1880, the Industrial Revolution had brought new possibilities to glove making. Factories in France, England, and Germany turned out gloves in finer leathers, with more precise stitching and sometimes even machine embroidery. But even with industrial advances, much of the warmth still came from age-old traditions. Layering, fur linings, and wool. A silk-lined glove was elegant, but a fur-lined glove was survival. And for the rich, having both meant style, could finally embrace comfort. One curious aspect of glove culture was etiquette. In upper-class society, gloves weren't just about warmth, they were about behavior. A man removed his gloves before greeting a lady as a sign of respect. A woman removed hers in church, but not in a carriage. Gloves, in this sense, were part of the dance of social ritual. But underneath the ritual lay the simple truth: you couldn't last long outside without them. Among rural communities, innovation never stopped. Farmers in Scandinavia sometimes lined gloves with dried moss for added insulation. Russian peasants layered mittens, a coarse outer mitten of sheepskin with a softer wool inner layer. In England, workers occasionally tied strips of cloth around their wrists to prevent icy drafts from sneaking in. Every trick mattered when frostbite was a daily threat. The symbolism of gloves also stretched into religion. In some medieval and early modern coronations, bishops or kings wore gloves embroidered with crosses, symbolizing purity and divine authority. By the 19th century, ceremonial gloves for clergy were still worn in icy cathedrals, their fur linings hidden beneath layers of gold thread embroidery. Warmth and sanctity walked hand in hand. Let's not forget the practical genius of fur hand coverings outside the aristocracy. Hunters, for example, relied on fur mittens that could fold back at the fingertips, allowing them to shoot arrows or rifles without completely exposing their hands. This balance of function and warmth shows how survival drove design. In frozen forests, a missed shot could mean hunger, so every stitch mattered. The most fascinating thing about gloves and hand coverings in 1880 is how they embodied both universality and difference. Everyone needed them: peasants, merchants, nobles, clergy, soldiers. Yet the material, cut, and decoration immediately revealed who you were. A ragged wool mitten whispered of poverty, but also resilience. A velvet glove lined with sable shouted of wealth, but also dependence on privilege. In this way, gloves were more than fabric. They were maps of society, stitched in wool, leather, and fur. They told the story of survival, of frozen mornings in peasant huts, of polished salons where ladies displayed jeweled muffs, of soldiers banking fires at camp, their hands shielded by fur-lined leather. The story of hands in winter was the story of humanity itself, fragile, vulnerable, but endlessly inventive. And perhaps the most touching detail? Gloves and mittens were often gifts of love. Mothers knitted them for children, wives stitched them for husbands, and lovers exchanged fine gloves as tokens of affection. In the brutal winter of 1880, a simple pair of gloves wasn't just protection, it was comfort, connection, and care. If gloves kept the hands alive in winter, scarves and shawls guarded one of the body's most vulnerable gateways, the neck and chest. In the bitter winters of Europe around 1880, when a cold wind could cut deeper than a blade, protecting that small stretch of skin often meant the difference between a lingering cough and another season of health. So families, no matter how poor or wealthy, wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: woolen cloth, animal hides, scraps of linen, or, for the fortunate, furs fine enough to gleam in the torchlight of a ballroom. Think about it for a moment. What happens first when icy wind hits your body? It slips beneath your collar, slides down your chest, and leaves you shivering from the core. That's why neck coverings weren't just fashion statements. They were survival tactics. A scarf wasn't about looking elegant in the village square, it was about protecting lungs from the damp that could turn into pneumonia, or guarding a laborer's voice so he could keep calling out commands in the fields. Among peasants, scarves were often no more than strips of rough wool, woven by hand at home. Mothers and daughters spun and twisted fibers, sometimes uneven, but strong enough to last the season. These woolen strips were wrapped tightly around the neck, tucked into tunics or cloaks, and pulled up over the mouth during storms. They were scratchy, yes, but effective. And like mittens, they weren't just garments, they were acts of care. A grandmother knitting a scarf for her grandson wasn't simply weaving fabric, she was trying to keep him alive through another brutal winter. For women, shawls carried both utility and meaning. Picture a farmer's wife stepping out to gather wood, her shoulders covered by a heavy woolen shawl, edges frayed but still warm. Shawls could be thrown over the head as a hood, wrapped tightly around the waist when chopping ice, or even used to cradle an infant against the chest. Some were simple rectangles of wool, others more elaborate with fringes or embroidery, but all served the same purpose: to trap warmth and block the wind. In villages across Eastern Europe, shawls also doubled as symbols of modesty. A woman's head covered, her neck hidden, she was at once warm and socially proper. Now step into the world of the wealthy, and the picture changes dramatically. Among noblewomen in the late 19th century, fur scarves became objects of both necessity and extravagance. Imagine a strip of white ermine draped across a lady's shoulders, or sable fur so dark it seemed to drink in the lamplight. These weren't just warm, they were declarations. To wear ermine was to signal rank, for certain furs were reserved by law for royalty and clergy. To wrap a fox fur stole around your neck was to say, I not only survive winter, I conquer it. But beyond luxury, fur was practical. The hollow structure of animal, hair trapped air, and insulated better than almost anything else. Hunters and traders knew this well. In Russia, men wore scarves of wolf or bear fur when traveling by sleigh across frozen landscapes. In Scandinavia, peasants tucked rabbit pelts inside their collars to stop icy drafts. And across the Alps, shepherds stitched together scraps of sheepskin to fashion shawls that kept them alive at high altitudes. Scarves also carried spiritual and cultural meanings. In Catholic Europe, for example, priests wore stoles, narrow strips of fabric draped around the neck. Though primarily liturgical, in freezing cathedrals, these served a practical function too. And in folk traditions, a red scarf around the neck was thought to ward off illness, particularly sore throats. Mothers tied crimson cloths around children in winter, not only for warmth, but for protection against unseen evils. Belief and survival intertwined in a single strip of fabric. By 1880, industrial weaving had transformed scarf making. Mills in England and France produced shawls patterned with intricate designs, influenced by Indian Kashmiri imports that had flooded Europe earlier in the century. These weren't just accessories for noble salons, they became part of middle-class wardrobes too. A woman might wear a paisley wool shawl over her Sunday best, feeling both stylish and secure against the winter air. The mass production of textiles meant more people than ever could own something beautiful and warm. But don't be fooled, not everyone enjoyed that comfort. In the harsh streets of industrial cities, many workers had only threadbare scarves, sometimes patched together from leftover fabric. Child laborers in factories wrapped rags around their throats as they trudged to work in the snow. The contrast was brutal. In one part of town, a merchant's wife showed off a silk-lined fur stole. In another, a factory girl tied a soot-stained rag around her neck and prayed it would block the wind for boss another day. Scarves also played a role in identity. Think of the kerchiefs worn by shepherds, tied at the front in simple knots, or the patterned headscarves of Eastern European women, passed down through generations. These weren't just clothing, they were markers of place, of family, of tradition. In the winter of 1880, wrapping a scarf wasn't only about staying alive, it was about showing who you were. There's one more detail often forgotten: how people improvised with scarves in storms. Travelers caught in sudden blizzards sometimes twisted long scarves across their mouths and noses, forming a kind of early face covering. It warmed the breath, kept frost from the lips, and shielded the skin from burning winds. Soldiers on campaign did the same, binding woolen cloths across their faces when the cold bit too hard. In the diaries of the Crimean War, British troops described how a strip of wool across the mouth could feel like salvation during a midnight frost. By the late 19th century, shawls and scarves had become almost universal. Farmers wore them, nobles flaunted them, workers relied on them, and each piece carried a hidden story of love in its making, of resilience in its wearing, of culture in its style. A scarf wasn't just fabric, It was a thread connecting people across class, geography, and history. If scarves and shawls were the shields of the neck and chest, cloaks and capes were the fortresses of the entire body. In the brutal winters of 1880, when wind screamed across cobblestone streets or howled over lonely farms, there was almost nothing more essential than the cloak. It was at once a blanket, a barrier, a symbol of status, and a survival tool. Without it, a man or woman stepping into the cold was already defeated. With it, they stood a chance. Cloaks had deep roots. For centuries in Europe, they were the simplest answer to one of humanity's oldest problems: how to wrap the whole body in warmth without restricting movement. A cloak was basically a large piece of fabric, often wool, fastened at the shoulder or throat with a brooch, cord, or clasp. But its simplicity was deceptive. Every detail, the weight of the wool, the presence of a fur lining, the length down to the ankles, the hood, or lack of one, determined how well its wearer survived the night. Picture a farmer trudging through snow in rural England. His cloak is heavy, woven from coarse wool that his wife or daughter may have spun by hand. The fabric is thick enough to shed light rain and snow, especially once it has absorbed oil or soot from years of use. He pulls it tight with a leather cord, wrapping it not only around his body, but sometimes over his arms, turning himself into a kind of human cocoon. This single garment becomes his greatest ally as he steps out to tend sheep in the frozen pasture. For the poor, cloaks were often patched and repatched, handed down from one generation to the next until the fabric thinned into rags. In some cases, they were the only winter garment beyond a tunic and stockings. The cloak was bed, coat, and blanket all in one. Medieval records from village courts even note thefts of cloaks as serious crimes, not because of vanity, but because stealing someone's cloak in January could literally endanger their life. Now contrast that with the upper classes in 1880. Cloaks among the nobility and wealthy urbanites became almost works of art. Ladies wore long capes trimmed with velvet or ermine fur, sweeping dramatically across ballroom floors or carriage steps. Gentlemen donned wool capes lined with silk, often with high collars that could be flipped up against icy winds. In Paris, fashion houses produced opera cloaks, elegant, flowing garments that looked like luxury but still carried the practicality of warmth when traveling at night. Yet beneath the drama of design, the purpose remained the same: insulation. That's where layering came in. The people of 1880 understood, just as their medieval ancestors had, that survival wasn't about one garment alone. It was about stacking barriers: a linen shirt to wick sweat, a wool tunic to trap heat, a vest or doublet for strength, and finally, a heavy cloak or cape to block the wind and snow. Each layer worked like the walls of a fortress, slowing the advance of the cold. One fascinating practice, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, was the use of fur capes worn over wool cloaks. Imagine 2 layers of armor: wool against the damp, fur against the wind. Shepherds wore sheepskin capes, called bundas in Hungary, that doubled as bedding when nights forced them to sleep outdoors. These were so thick and heavy that they could stand upright on their own, but they kept men alive in the open fields where temperatures dropped below freezing. In cities, capes evolved into stylish symbols as well. The Victorian Inverness cape, popular around 1880, featured a sleeveless overcloak draping over the shoulders and arms. It became famous in detective fiction. Sherlock Holmes himself is often pictured in one, but its roots were practical. It allowed freedom of arm movement while still providing warmth. Cab drivers, policemen, and gentlemen in fog-drenched London wore them not for fashion, but for function. The cape kept out drizzle, mist, and sleet, while the layers underneath trapped heat. For women, cloaks often carried dual purposes of warmth and modesty. A lady stepping out into the winter streets of Berlin or Vienna would fasten a full-length cloak, sometimes lined with quilted silk, that concealed her figure and protected her from the cold. Mothers wrapped children in their cloaks as they traveled, folding little bodies into the same warmth. In this way, cloaks became communal garments, one piece of fabric serving 2 or 3 people at once. But there was more. Cloaks and capes weren't just worn, they were used. Travelers often spread them across straw pallets as bedding, or draped them over doors and windows to block drafts. In villages, a heavy cloak might be laid across a sick child at night, substituting for a blanket. Soldiers on campaign slept rolled inside their cloaks, pulling hoods tight over their faces against the frost. The garment wasn't simply part of the wardrobe, it was part of the household arsenal against winter itself. And cloaks carried status. Fur-trimmed garments announced wealth the way jewelry did. Ermine, sable, mink, these weren't just warm, they were declarations of power. A mayor in France wearing an ermine-lined cloak wasn't only warm, he was broadcasting privilege. Meanwhile, peasants made do with sheepskin or coarse wool, materials that smelled of lanolin and smoke but held heat just the same. The divide was stark. Yet across classes the principle remained. Without a cloak, you did not face the winter. There are curious small details too. In some regions, people sewed pockets of herbs into their cloaks, hoping lavender or rosemary would mask the smell of damp wool or ward off fleas. In others, red thread stitched into hems was believed to protect against illness. In snowstorms, travelers sometimes tied the edges of cloaks together beneath their legs, transforming the garment into a full-body sack of warmth. Such improvisations remind us how inventive people became when survival was at stake. By the 1882, industrial production had made wool cloaks more widely available, but handmade ones remained treasures. Families prized them not only for warmth but for memory. A father's cloak might later be worn by his son, the fabric frayed but still carrying the scent of wood smoke from years of hearth fires. A mother's winter cape might be passed to a daughter as part of her trousseau, a token of both love and survival knowledge. These garments weren't disposable, they were legacy. Think of the scene. A blizzard outside, snow piling against wooden huts, frost forming on cottage windows. Inside, by the glow of a fire, cloaks hang heavy on pegs, steaming faintly from melted snow. They wait for morning, for another day of labor in fields or travel along icy roads. Each cloak is a warrior's shield, scarred but enduring, holding back the bite of a winter that never showed mercy. Cloaks and capes were not fashion afterthoughts in the winter of 1880. They were lifelines. And when combined with scarves, gloves, stockings, and boots, they formed a system, a full-body strategy of layers and improvisations that kept men, women, and children alive through nights when the temperature could turn deadly. When you look at an old painting of a nobleman in a sweeping cloak, or a peasant trudging through snow in patched wool, it's easy to focus on the outer layer. But ask anyone who lived through the winters of 1880, the real secret to survival often began with what lay beneath. Undergarments and stockings, those invisible first lines of defense, were what made the difference between shivering and enduring. At its simplest, the base layer was linen. Almost everyone in Europe owned a linen shirt or chemise, and this garment was worn closest to the skin, day and night. Why linen? Because it breathed, it absorbed sweat, and it could be washed far more easily than heavy wool or leather. In the damp, smoky huts of peasants or the drafty stone manors of the wealthy, sweat and grime built up quickly. A washable linen layer acted like a filter, keeping the outer garments usable for longer. In the cold, that linen alone wasn't enough. Over it came woolen hose or stockings, often reaching up to the thigh, and held in place by garters. These hose weren't the sleek silk stockings you might picture in Renaissance portraits. By 1880, especially in rural Europe, stockings were thick, hand-knitted, and sometimes patched over and over until they were more darning than original thread. They trapped warm air against the skin, and though they itched terribly, they were indispensable. Peasants often relied on multiple layers of hose if they could afford it. One pair of coarse wool stockings might be pulled on over another, with scraps of cloth or straw stuffed between for added insulation. Travelers in the Alps or northern England sometimes wrapped rags around their legs under or over their stockings, creating a kind of makeshift padding against the cold. It wasn't elegant, but it kept frostbite at bay. And here's a detail you won't find in most romanticized stories of the past. People stuffed hay or dried moss inside their stockings. Yes, moss. It absorbed sweat, filled gaps, and provided surprisingly effective insulation when boots or shoes offered little protection. Imagine trudging through ankle-deep snow with feet wrapped not in high-tech wool socks, but in a blend of straw, moss, and patched linen. Primitive? Absolutely. Effective? Without question. For the wealthy, stockings were works of art as much as survival gear. Knitted from finer wool, sometimes dyed in rich colors or decorated with embroidery, they combined warmth with display. A nobleman's stockings might flash a bright scarlet when his cloak shifted, signaling wealth even in winter. Ladies wore stockings of lighter wool or even silk layered over wool in the harshest months, pairing necessity with fashion. But stockings alone weren't enough. Over the linen shirt, men wore woolen breeches or long drawers, essentially the first pants. These garments covered the thighs and hips, preserving warmth in the body's core. Women's underdresses, made of linen or wool, served the same purpose, trapping heat close to the skin before outer skirts and gowns were added. In some regions, quilted petticoats became a staple, layers of fabric stitched together with padding inside, essentially wearable blankets. What's fascinating is how undergarments also reflected class. For the poor, they were plain, patched, and endlessly reused. A linen shirt might last years, worn until it was threadbare, then cut down for children. For the wealthy, undergarments became softer, lighter, and more luxurious, but still practical. Even a duke needed wool drawers in January. Comfort and warmth ignored no rank. There were even folk tricks tied to these hidden garments. In rural France, women sometimes stitched tiny red threads into the hem of a chemise, believing the color would protect the wearer from illness. In Germany, some families added sprigs of dried herbs into stockings during winter, thinking the fragrance could ward off spirits or disease. Whether superstition or genuine comfort, these details reveal how much care people put into the layers nobody saw. By 1880, industrial knitting had begun producing stockings and undergarments at larger scale, especially in cities like Manchester or Lyon. But in villages, hand knitting was still a winter occupation. Families gathered by the hearth to mend and make, knowing that every stitch was another line of defense against the biting cold. A broken seam could mean a freezing draft against the skin. And in a world without antibiotics or heated homes, a chill could turn into sickness fast. Think about it. Today we take socks and underwear for granted, tossing them into drawers and replacing them easily. In 1880, each piece was precious. Stockings were darned until they were thick with repairs. Linen shirts were patched until they were more patch than shirt. Every layer had to last, because fabric cost labor and money, both scarce resources in harsh winters. And yet, these hidden layers carried as much symbolism as outerwear. A well-made linen shirt, visible only at the collar or cuffs, suggested cleanliness and order. A noblewoman's quilted petticoat, glimpsed when she lifted her skirts, hinted at wealth. Even in the coldest season, undergarments quietly told the story of who you were. If there was one part of the body that suffered most in the winter of 1880, it was the feet. Cold hands were bad enough, but frozen toes could cripple you, cut short a workday, or worse, invite frostbite that led to permanent damage. And yet, footwear was often the hardest item to come by. For peasants across Europe, the most common footwear was the wooden clog. Cheap, durable, and easy to repair, clogs were carved from a single block of wood and sometimes lined with scraps of wool or straw. They weren't comfortable by modern standards, but they kept feet off the frozen ground and lasted for years. In regions like the Netherlands and northern France, clogs were so common that entire villages echoed with the clack of wood on cobblestone during the long winters. In poorer households, clogs weren't lined at all. People stuffed hay, moss, or even scraps of cloth inside to create a crude insulation. Children sometimes went without shoes entirely in the summer, saving clogs for winter months when frost made barefoot living impossible. Imagine walking through snow with nothing but straw-filled wooden shoes. Crude, yes, but better than frostbite. For those who could afford more, leather boots became the gold standard. By 1880, cobblers crafted boots with thick soles, layered from leather and sometimes reinforced with iron nails. These boots repelled snow and rain better than clogs, though they required regular oiling and care. The wealthy often lined their boots with fur sheep, fox, or even more luxurious pelts, creating footwear that was not just functional, but enviable. A nobleman's boots weren't just warm. They were a statement of status, polished and embroidered, with fur peeking at the edges as a sign of refinement. Travelers and soldiers relied on sturdy boots to survive long marches in winter. Diaries from the late 19th century tell of men wrapping strips of cloth around their feet before pulling on boots, creating a double layer of protection. In some regions, people even used animal fat or grease to coat the leather, sealing it against moisture. The smell wasn't pleasant, but a waterproofed boot could mean the difference between life and death in deep snow. And let's not forget women's footwear. By 1880, fashion in cities leaned toward high-button leather boots for ladies, laced snugly to the calf. These boots combined elegance with practicality, allowing women to walk through slush without soaking their skirts. In rural areas, women wore simpler leather shoes or shared clogs with their children, often layering socks and wrapping feet in rags to make them fit. Shoes were too precious to waste. They were patched, resoled, and passed down until they nearly fell apart. One fascinating detail comes from Scandinavia. People there sometimes crafted shoes from reindeer or sealskin, designed to withstand the deep Arctic cold. The fur was left on the inside, turning the footwear into natural insulation. Hunters and herders in snowy regions depended on these, learning tricks passed down for generations. They even sprinkled snow inside before putting them on, letting the moisture freeze quickly and form a barrier that kept warmth trapped. Primitive science, but surprisingly effective. Folk traditions also crept into footwear. In parts of Eastern Europe, a red thread was sewn into the tongue of boots as a charm against frostbite. Some families placed small iron nails in the soles, not just to strengthen them, but believing iron repelled evil spirits said to lurk in winter storms. A shoe was never just a shoe, it was protection, spiritually and physically. Yet even the best boots couldn't guarantee warmth. People still relied on layers inside. Moss, hay, wool scraps, even old cloth torn from garments too ragged to wear. Each night, shoes and boots were set close to the hearth, not only to dry, but to prevent them from freezing solid. A pair of frozen boots could be impossible to pull on in the morning, turning survival into a daily battle. The contrast between rich and poor was stark. The wealthy stepped through snow in fur-lined leather, polished and strong. The poor trudged with patched clogs, straw spilling from the sides, praying they lasted another season. But whether in castles or cottages, everyone understood one truth. If your feet failed, your body followed. Warmth began from the ground up. If boots kept the feet alive, scarves and shawls kept the wind from stealing breath straight out of the chest. In the brutal winters of the late 19th century, when temperatures could plummet and blizzards sweep across whole towns, what people wore around their neck and shoulders often made the difference between enduring the storm or collapsing in it. Peasants didn't have neatly woven scarves like the kind you find in stores today. Instead, they took what they had: strips of linen, patched wool, even pieces of old clothing torn into long lengths, and wound them around their throats and mouths. A ragged strip of cloth, when tied tight, did more than warm the neck. It trapped each breath, letting air enter the lungs less sharply, easing the ache of breathing icy air. Farmers walking to the barn before dawn often looked like mummies, faces half-wrapped, steam rising through fabric. For women, shawls were essential. Large squares of wool, sometimes woven at home on small looms, were draped across the shoulders, crossed in front, and tied at the waist with a simple cord. This style kept the cloth snug and freed the arms for work. A mother could carry a baby beneath the shawl, both shielded from wind, sharing body heat under the same fabric. Many shawls doubled as head coverings too, pulled upward when storms raged, turning into hoods in a matter of seconds. In wealthier households, shawls and scarves became status symbols. The gentry wrapped themselves in furs, fox, mink, sable, with long pelts draped dramatically over shoulders. A fur scarf wasn't just warmth, it was theater. The longer and softer the fur, the higher the status of the wearer. In portraits from the 1880 seconds, noblewomen are often shown with white ermine stoles, fur gleaming against velvet gowns, a sign of both refinement and survival. But fur wasn't only for display. Hunters and villagers alike knew that fur retained heat better than any woven fabric. A fox skin, draped fur inward, could keep the biting wind from gnawing at the throat. Some even left the animal's head attached, fastening it like a clasp, the teeth biting into the tail to hold it in place. Odd to us now, but practical to them, no need for buttons or pins when nature provided its own. Men working outdoors often wore thick wool mufflers, wrapped several times around the neck. These weren't delicate scarves, but heavy, scratchy barriers against frost. They hung stiff with ice by the end of a workday, breath frozen into the fibers, yet men swore by them. In seaport towns, sailors tied scarves across their faces to shield from the sting of sea spray turned to ice midair. Even children were swaddled in scarves. Mothers tied cloth around their necks so tightly that only the eyes peeked through. Village diaries note how children complained about the itch of rough wool, but mothers knew that an itchy neck was better than a frozen one. A saying went, "Better scratched than blue." Scarves were also tools of improvisation. In emergencies, they became bandages, slings, or even ropes. A woman might tie a scarf across a leaking window to block drafts, then snatch it back to wrap her child before bed. In folk traditions, red scarves carried symbolic meaning believed to ward off fevers and chills. Some women stitched a red patch into shawls deliberately, trusting color as much as warmth. Travelers had their own methods. During snowstorms, they wound scarves not just around their necks, but across their hats, tying them under the chin so fabric covered forehead, ears, mouth, and throat in one. This made them look like bundled phantoms, but it gave them the best chance of reaching their destination alive. And, of course, scarves weren't immune to fashion. By 1880, city folk had begun to prize long, flowing scarves, patterned with plaid or embroidered at the ends, while rural folk stuck to simpler wool strips. What united them was function, wrapping, layering, protecting every gap where wind might enter. Because in that year 1880, whether you were a farmer trudging through snow, a mother cradling her baby, or a noble flaunting fox fur in the city square, the scarf or shawl wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline. They used to say that if your head was warm, the rest of your body stood a chance. In the bitter winters of the late 19th century, that saying wasn't superstition, it was survival wisdom. People knew from experience that most of the body's heat escaped through the head, so no one stepped into the snow without some kind of covering. For peasants and working class folk, the simplest solution was the woolen cap. Rough, scratchy, and often homemade, these caps clung tight around the scalp, keeping snow off the hair and trapping warmth. Farmers wore them pulled low, almost covering the ears. Some stitched ear flaps on, tying strings beneath the chin. making early versions of what we'd recognize today as winter hats with ties. They weren't pretty, but they were warm, and that was all that mattered when winds cut across open fields. Children were often bundled in hand-me-down hoods, patched from older garments. Mothers wrapped extra strips of wool around the forehead or chin to keep them from slipping. Diaries from the 1,880 seconds mention how kids grumbled about itching caps. But those same caps kept frostbite from biting tiny ears. A scratched forehead was a small price compared to frozen skin. Among women, shawls often doubled as head coverings. A large square of wool folded into a triangle could be tied beneath the chin, creating a hood-like protection against snow and sleet. In villages, women were rarely without such coverings in winter. Even indoors, many kept linen caps on their heads to trap warmth and to keep smoke and soot from clinging to their hair. In towns and cities, headwear became more than practical. It was fashion layered onto survival. Gentlemen wore felt top hats in fair weather, but in real cold, many switched to fur caps. The Russian-style ushanka, with ear flaps that could be tied over the crown or dropped to cover ears and jaw, made its way across Europe by trade, prized for its unbeatable warmth. In Paris and London, fur-trimmed hats became fashionable accessories for both men and women, turning survival gear into statements of class. For noble women, elaborate bonnets lined with silk and trimmed with fur weren't just pretty ornaments. They served a dual-purpose elegance for public life, warmth for private necessity. A bonnet might be edged with ermine or fox fur, giving both status and insulation. Inside, a linen cap or silk lining kept the hair neat, protecting expensive hairstyles from collapse under layers of fabric. Sailors and soldiers had their own traditions. Sailors wore thick, knitted watch caps, snug wool hats that clung close in whipping sea winds. Soldiers, especially those stationed in northern garrisons, relied on fur helmets or heavy leather caps lined with fleece. These were not decorative, but hard-tested by snow marches and freezing bivouacs. One fascinating practice noted in rural accounts was the layering of headwear. People wore a thin linen coif, a snug skull cap beneath a wool hood, and sometimes even a cloak's cowl drawn over everything. This layering trapped air like insulation in a house, keeping warmth from leaking away. Peasants might look bulky with 3 or 4 head coverings stacked at once, but when the storm howled, appearance mattered far less than breath still steaming in the air. Even folk traditions crept into headwear. In some regions, mothers stitched a red thread into children's caps, believing it warded off winter fevers. Others tied small charms, a button, a cross, or even a dried herb pouch inside the lining. So protection was spiritual as well as physical. Whether these charms truly helped or not, the comfort of believing added an extra layer of warmth in itself. By the 1,880 seconds, with industrial weaving advancing, machine-knit caps began to spread more widely. Still, in rural villages, the handmade wool hood remained the staple. A grandmother might sit by the hearth, knitting late into the night, producing caps for the whole family before the first snow fell. Each stitch carried both necessity and love. If cloaks, shawls, and fur boots were the shield against winter's bite, then the real armor lay hidden beneath the underlayers. These were the first defense, worn closest to the skin, and in many ways they decided whether a person would endure the night or wake up shivering. In 1880, the poorest people rarely had more than 2 or 3 changes of clothing in their lifetime. That meant the base layer, usually a linen shirt or shift, did double duty. It absorbed sweat, oils, and grime, keeping the heavier outer garments from becoming foul too quickly. Even in the coldest months, people stripped down to wash or replace this one item, because without a clean base layer, skin infections and rashes spread fast. Linen was the preferred material. It might sound strange to wear a light fabric in the dead of winter, but linen had one unbeatable quality. It wicked moisture away. A sweaty body left in damp wool could chill dangerously fast. Linen kept the skin drier, even if the air was frigid. On top of linen came wool, always wool. Wool drawers for men, woolen petticoats for women, thick wool stockings for everyone. Wool was the miracle fabric of its age. It trapped heat, resisted water, and even when damp, still held warmth. Imagine trudging through slush, or sitting in a smoke-filled hut. No fabric worked harder than wool. Children were bundled in layers of patched stockings, sometimes tied with garters of ribbon or scrap fabric to keep them from slipping. Mothers knew that bare legs meant frostbite, so they wrapped their little ones until they could barely bend their knees. Diaries mentioned children waddling like little geese under so many layers, but parents would rather laugh at clumsiness than mourn a frozen limb. Among working men, underlayers often included long woolen drawers worn beneath hose or breeches. Farmers tucked these into boots, sailors rolled them tight at the ankle, and laborers patched holes endlessly because they couldn't afford replacements. For women, quilted petticoats became lifesavers. These weren't glamorous. They were heavy, padded skirts worn under dresses, stitched with layers of wool or even old rags. Each added layer meant another shield against cold winds sneaking up from the ground. The wealthy took underlayers to another level. Fine linen chemises were embroidered, not out of necessity, but as marks of refinement. Silk linings appeared beneath gowns, offering a softness no peasant would ever feel. Fur-trimmed drawers lined the legs of noblemen, while noblewomen wore underskirts padded with down feathers. Comfort, luxury, and survival all in one. But even among the elite, function mattered. Medical guides of the time recommended a flannel waistcoat nearest the skin to ward off lung illness. Flannel, a softer variation of wool, became hugely popular in the 19th century as doctors swore by its ability to guard against chills. In fact, many Victorians in 1880 wore flannel directly under their shirts, believing it could prevent tuberculosis or pneumonia. There were also clever tricks. Some families stitched bits of fur or leather into the lining of undergarments around the chest or kidneys, the body's heat centers. Others layered 2 or 3 linen shirts, using the thinnest fabric available to trap air between them. Air itself, when held still, acted as insulation. For laborers who worked outdoors all day, underwear was sometimes their only luxury. A clean woolen undershirt could mean the difference between steady work and being bedridden with a cough that never left. Factory workers in cold, unheated spaces layered every scrap they owned beneath aprons and overalls. Some wrapped paper or newspaper beneath their clothes. Yes, even that became insulation when nothing else was at hand. And of course, underwear in 1880 wasn't just about warmth, it was about dignity. Women guarded their linen chemises carefully, knowing they might be the only item washed weekly. Men prized their flannel drawers because it meant they could face winter fields without trembling. To us today, base layers might seem invisible, almost an afterthought, but in 1880, they were the quiet, constant guardians of life. Think about it. A wool cloak might impress onlookers. A fur muff might signal wealth, but the battle for survival always began closest to the skin. Linen, wool, flannel. They were the foundations on which every other garment rested. Without them, the grandest fur cloak would fail. If underlayers were the foundation, then cloaks and coats were the fortress walls. In 1880, no one braved winter without some form of outer covering. Whether you were a farmer trudging through frostbitten fields, a child running errands in the village, or a noble stepping out of a carriage, the outermost garment decided how long you could endure the elements. The most common and practical choice was wool. Thick, coarse cloaks cut from local sheep's wool were a staple for peasants. These garments were rarely elegant. They were heavy, scratchy, and often smelled faintly of lanolin. But they worked. Wool repelled moisture, held heat, and resisted wear even in snow and sleet. In fact, many accounts describe cloaks so well used they doubled as bedding at night, wrapped tight around shoulders and tucked beneath straw. But cloaks weren't just blankets with ties. They were engineered with purpose. The cut often extended below the knees to guard against icy winds, and hoods were either built in or added separately. A wide cloak could be pulled over the head entirely, turning into a crude tent against snowstorms. Mothers often used their cloaks to cover children, spreading their warmth across 2 or 3 bodies at once. For men working outdoors, greatcoats became the badge of endurance. These long, tailored coats, often military in style, were lined with flannel or fur, double-breasted for maximum warmth. Soldiers, postmen, and factory guards relied on them. A greatcoat wasn't light. It could weigh 10 pounds or more. But in bitter winds, that weight was a comfort. Diaries from railway workers in 1880 mention the coat as heavy as duty itself. Yet without it, the bones froze. Women, too, relied on outerwear, though theirs often carried more flair. Long woolen cloaks, trimmed with fur, not only provided warmth, but marked status. In cities, wealthy women donned velvet mantles lined with sable or mink. In rural towns, the same silhouette existed, but the fabric might be patched wool or rabbit fur, pieced together with care. Fashion and survival intertwined, but survival always won. Scarves and shawls played a massive role in layering. In blizzards, woolen shawls were wrapped over the head, crossed over the chest, and tied at the back, a technique that created an extra layer over the lungs and heart, shielding them from cold air. In some regions, families even passed down specific ways of tying shawls, turning technique into tradition. And when snowstorms hit unexpectedly, women sometimes dipped woolen shawls in warm water and wrapped them quickly around children, trapping a sudden burst of heat. Hoods, too, were vital. Unlike modern detachable hoods, these were often integrated into cloaks or coats. A fur-lined hood turned a simple cloak into full protection. Fox fur, badger fur, or even sheepskin were sewn into the lining. Poorer families improvised, sewing scraps of fur from trapped animals into the rims of hoods, creating makeshift insulation. One traveler's account from 1882 described peasant families pulling the skins of rabbits, still stiff, around their cloak hoods to shield their faces during storms. Gloves and mittens, though small, were part of the outer armor. Mittens of wool kept fingers alive, while leather gloves lined with fleece provided dexterity for work. Children often wore mittens, tied with a string running through their coat sleeves, a clever detail that has survived into modern children's clothing. Losing mittens in 1880 wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Frostbite waited for any uncovered skin. Boots completed the system. For most peasants, leather boots greased with animal fat kept water out. Wealthier citizens wore high leather boots with fur linings, sometimes trimmed with decorative stitching. In desperate conditions, people wrapped cloth or burlap around their feet inside shoes, adding straw for insulation. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And let's not forget one of the most overlooked survival tricks: layering outerwear. Some peasants wore two cloaks at once, an inner coarse wool cloak and an outer patched, weather-beaten one. This layering trapped air and made even the poorest fabric stretch its usefulness. Wealthy families did the same in their own way, layering silks, furs, and velvets to showcase both survival and splendor. The symbolism of outerwear ran deep. A man's cloak or greatcoat marked his role: a soldier, a traveler, a farmer, or a beggar. A woman's mantle told of her station, her husband's earnings, her ability to withstand gossip as much as weather. But beneath the symbolism, every stitch of wool and fur carried the same message: survival. Because in 1880, when storms swept across Europe and America alike, outerwear was the only barrier between life and frostbite. The hut's walls might creak, the hearth might dim, but as long as you had wool across your shoulders, fur at your neck, and leather at your feet, you could endure another night. When we look back at the winters of the 1,880 seconds, what stands out is not just the bitter cold or the endless snowdrifts, but the quiet ingenuity of ordinary people. Every cloak, every scarf, every patched mitten was a story of survival. Clothing wasn't fashion first, it was strategy, protection, even prayer stitched into fabric. Think about it. A woolen cloak doubled as a blanket. A shawl wrapped 3 different ways could shield a chest, cover a face, or bind a child close against the storm. Boots weren't just footwear. They were lifelines greased and patched until they could walk through ice once more. Nothing was wasted because everything mattered. The wealthy wore velvet lined with sable. The poor wore patched wool lined with rabbit fur. But both were fighting the same enemy, the cold. And while status made a difference in luxury, the truth is that every family, every village, depended on the same principle: layering, adapting, and enduring. What's striking is how much of their wisdom still lingers today. The mittens tied with a string so children wouldn't lose them. The layering of scarves across chest and back. Even the idea of fur trim around hoods, something modern parkas still copy, all came from those long, desperate winters where survival demanded creativity. It reminds us of a simple truth: comfort is not guaranteed, it's created. By hands that sew, by families that share, by small tricks passed from grandmother to child. Medieval winter clothing, carried into the 1,880 seconds, wasn't just about warmth. It was about resilience, about hope stitched into every seam. So as we end this story tonight, picture those heavy cloaks, those smoky woolen shawls, those boots lined with fur. Picture the people who wore them, stepping into the snow with courage, wrapping children tighter, holding on until dawn. Hey guys, thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you enjoyed walking through history together, don't forget to leave a like and hit that follow so you won't miss what's next. And now, as those families once whispered, "Thanks for surviving another night," I'll leave you with the same blessing. May your own nights be warm. May your own blankets feel heavy with comfort. And may you wake to the light of a new day. Good night, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.